The early morning air was crisp, and the faint smell of coffee mingled with the city's damp streets. Marcus, a veteran whose medals had long been tucked away in forgotten drawers, sat on a worn park bench, sipping from a steaming cup. For a fleeting moment the world felt quiet, like it had pressed pause just for him. Then the screech of tires and the sharp thrum of authority cut through the calm. 2 patrol cars rolled to a stop nearby. Officers stepped out, their eyes scanning the bench where Marcus sat. His heart didn't race, not yet. He knew fear, but he also knew dignity. One call, one simple call he had been holding on to all these years. And today, it might just change everything. The first light of dawn crept over the city skyline, spilling orange and gold across cracked sidewalks and shuttered storefronts. Marcus sat on a cold, weathered park bench near the corner of 5th and Main, his hands wrapped around a paper cup of coffee that still steamed in the morning chill. He savored the warmth as it spread slowly through his fingers, letting the aroma carry him back to simpler days. Days when he had a uniform, a purpose, and a home to return to after long deployments. Today, though, the streets were his home, the park bench, his temporary refuge. And the coffee? Well, the coffee was a rare luxury, courtesy of Mrs. Delaney, the cafe owner who had known him for years. Her smile in the morning was genuine but tinged with worry. She always asked if he was okay, if he needed anything, and Marcus always nodded, grateful yet proud enough to decline more than he accepted. He opened a small, tattered notebook he carried in his coat pocket, the edges frayed from years of handling. Inside were sketches, notes, and memories. A diary of sorts, documenting both dreams and regrets. Some pages were filled with names of people he had served with in faraway lands, others with poems he had written during sleepless nights under military tents. He flipped to a blank page, tapped his pen against it, and stared at the city waking up around him. Life had not been kind. After leaving the military, the world he had fought to protect seemed determined to forget him. Jobs slipped through his fingers, medical bills piled up, and the PTSD he carried like a hidden wound made every interaction a silent battle. Eventually, the apartment he once called home became unaffordable. Evictions followed, family ties frayed, under the weight of stress and disappointment. And now, he existed in a delicate balance of survival, routines, and the small kindnesses of strangers. He took another sip of coffee, letting it warm his chest. Across the street, a few early commuters hurried past, heads down, earbuds in, oblivious to the man who had once stood for his country. Yet not all had forgotten. The mailman waved, a neighbor from a few blocks over shouted a friendly, "Morning?" and Mrs. Delaney had left him a muffin beside his cup. Small gestures, but reminders that he was still seen. For a moment he allowed himself to breathe, to feel the quiet dignity that came from surviving another night on the streets. And then the peace shattered. The first sound was faint, a distant siren, barely audible over the city hum. Then a pair of police patrol cars screeched to a halt nearby, the engines echoing against brick walls and concrete sidewalks. Marcus felt their presence before he saw them. The way the morning shifted, the subtle tightening of shoulders, the alertness in the air. 2 officers stepped out, their boots crunching against gravel. One carried a radio, clicking it with practiced ease. The other scanned the benches and sidewalks, eyes narrowing when they settled on Marcus. "Sir?" the taller one called, voice firm but not yet harsh. "You can't be here." Marcus remained calm. He didn't flinch, didn't raise his voice. He had encountered authority many times before, some helpful, some not, and he had learned the hard way that panic accomplished nothing. Instead, he let his gaze meet theirs evenly, his grip on the coffee cup steady. "I'm just having my morning coffee," he said quietly. His voice carried no challenge, only honesty. The officers exchanged a glance, one of those silent conversations that spoke volumes. "We've had complaints about loitering," the shorter one said. "You need to move along." Marcus nodded slowly, as if considering their words. "I understand," he said, "but I just need a few minutes. One call, that's all." The phrase hung in the air, unassuming but loaded. One call could mean Nothing, or it could mean everything. The officers hesitated, the tension palpable. Marcus didn't elaborate. He didn't have to. The weight of his words carried the kind of authority that came from lived experience, from someone who had faced life and death situations with nothing but discipline and quiet determination. He reached into his coat pocket and retrieved a small, worn cell phone. It had been a lifeline for years, connecting him to scattered resources, old friends, and memories of a life once lived. Now, it might connect him to the future he had been quietly hoping for all this time. As he dialed, Marcus reflected on how he had ended up here. The war abroad had ended, but the battle at home was ongoing. He had returned to a country that praised veterans in speeches and ceremonies but often failed them in practice. Mental health services were patchy, housing was scarce, and the bureaucracy of assistance programs could overwhelm even the most persistent. He had been proud once, but pride alone didn't pay rent or prevent loneliness from sinking its teeth into the soul. His finger hovered over the call button. Outside, the city carried on, oblivious. A bird chirped from a nearby lamppost. A delivery truck rumbled past. And for a heartbeat, Marcus felt the quiet thrill of hope, a feeling he hadn't indulged in for years. Then a voice interrupted his thoughts. "You really think one call will change anything?" the taller officer asked, skepticism in his tone. Marcus looked up, meeting the gaze firmly. "Sometimes," he said, "all it takes is one chance." The words were simple, but they carried weight. For Marcus, this was more than a call. It was a step toward reclaiming himself, toward proving that despite years of struggle, he was not done. Not yet. He pressed the button, and the call connected. A calm voice answered. "Hello, veterans. Support network. How can I help you today?" And just like that, the morning changed. The tension that had thickened like fog began to lift, replaced by a quiet current of possibility. Marcus's voice, steady and resolute, began to outline the story he had carried for years, the hardships, the loneliness, the dreams deferred. And for the first time in a long while, someone listened, truly listened, without judgment. As he spoke, the officers lingered nearby, shifting slightly but saying nothing. Even they seemed to sense that this was more than a minor incident. It was the beginning of something bigger, something that could not be contained by complaints or by benches in a park. Marcus hung up, a small but genuine smile crossing his face. He had taken the first step, and while the road ahead would be long, filled with uncertainty and effort, he felt the spark of hope ignite inside him. The struggle wasn't over, but for the first time in years, it felt like it might be winnable. The city carried on around him, cars honking, people rushing past, but Marcus sat a little taller, coffee in hand, dignity intact. One call had been made, and in that moment, he knew that everything could change. The turning point. The call had ended, but the warmth it left in Marcus's chest lingered like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. The voice on the other end, Sarah, a social worker at the Veterans Support Network, had been calm, patient, and genuinely concerned. For the first time in years, Marcus felt a flicker of connection, a sense that someone beyond the streets, beyond the cold concrete and judgmental glances, actually believed in him. He sipped the remaining coffee slowly, letting the aroma anchor him. The officers had returned to their cars, watching from a distance, unsure if they should intervene. Marcus didn't flinch. He had learned long ago that dignity was not given. It was maintained, even in the quietest acts, like finishing a cup of coffee without fear. By the next morning, a small envelope was slipped under the bench where he had slept. Inside was a handwritten note with a name, a number, and a promise. "We'll help you. Come by any time. Sarah." Marcus held the paper like a lifeline. It wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a doorway. A door he had been waiting for, but never thought he would see open. The next steps were slow, deliberate. Marcus arrived at the modest offices of the Veterans Support Network, a small building tucked between a laundromat and a diner. Sarah greeted him with a warm smile that felt unforced, a rarity in his years of navigating bureaucracy and indifference. "Marcus," she said gently, "I've read a little about your service. I want to help you find stability, housing, medical, care, and work opportunities. But it starts with trust. Are you ready to take that first step?" He nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. It was strange to feel hope without guilt, strange to accept help without shame. The turning point came slowly, almost imperceptibly, like dawn itself. The first challenge was housing. The shelters were crowded, often understaffed, and sometimes unsafe. Sarah connected him to a small, supportive transitional housing program specifically for veterans. It wasn't much, a single room with peeling paint and a shared bathroom, but it was a start, a place he could call his own, even for a little while. Next came medical care. Marcus's PTSD had been a constant shadow, lurking behind every interaction, every unexpected noise, every crowded street corner. For years he had refused therapy, distrustful of a system he felt had failed him before. But with Sarah's encouragement, he met with Dr. Allen, a psychiatrist specializing in trauma in veterans. The sessions were not easy. The memories were raw. There were days when Marcus left the office shaking, thinking he might never be whole. But each session left him slightly stronger, slightly more aware that the past did not have to define the future. Work, too, was a challenge. Marcus had skills honed from years of military service, discipline, leadership, problem-solving, but translating those skills to civilian employment had been nearly impossible. Through Sarah, he connected with a local veterans employment program that matched him with a small security firm. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid enough for groceries and transportation. More importantly, it gave him a renewed sense of purpose. But the most transformative part of this turning point was something Marcus hadn't anticipated: connection. He began meeting other veterans at group sessions, men and women who had faced homelessness, addiction, and despair. They shared stories, sometimes humorous, sometimes heart-wrenching. Marcus began to realize he was not alone, and in listening to others, he found the courage to speak his own truth. He also reconnected with family, slowly, cautiously, and a strange sister whom he hadn't seen since he left for the military decades ago reached out after hearing about his efforts through a community bulletin. Their reunion was tentative, awkward, but healing. It reminded Marcus that while he had endured immense loss, relationships could still be rebuilt, brick by brick. One afternoon, sitting in his small room with the evening sun casting warm patterns on the walls, Marcus opened his notebook once more. He wrote with newfound clarity, memories of service, the struggles of survival, the kindness of strangers, and the first taste of hope. The pen moved quickly, words flowing freely. It was no longer just a diary. It was a testament to resilience, a guide for others who might find themselves in the dark streets he had once called home. Every small step reinforced his belief. Progress was not measured in leaps, but in the daily commitment to rise, to show up, to keep moving. He began volunteering, helping other veterans navigate the network, sharing advice and offering encouragement. He became a living example of what the right support, combined with perseverance, could achieve. Yet the streets still haunted him, in memories. Some nights, the echoes of cold concrete, distant sirens, and faces blurred by hardship returned. But now, instead of succumbing to despair, he would pause, breathe, and remind himself of the path he had started on. The first call, the first connection, the first chance at reclaiming his life. Sarah noticed the change, too. "Marcus," she said one morning, "you've come so far, and yet the work you're doing for others, it's remarkable. You're not just surviving anymore, you're leading." It was not an easy path. There were setbacks, paperwork lost, appointments missed, days when old habits threatened to pull him back. But Marcus had learned patience and persistence, and each setback was a lesson, each small victory a reason to keep moving forward. By the end of this turning point, Marcus had achieved something profound. He had transformed his struggle into purpose. What had begun as a single call, the very call that seemed almost insignificant, had set off a chain reaction. One act, one step, one choice at a time, had begun to undo years of neglect and despair. And as Marcus walked through the city streets that evening, the lights reflecting in puddles from a recent rain, he felt a quiet sense of triumph. The struggle was not over, but the path forward was now visible, lit by hope, perseverance, and the unshakable belief that life could change, sometimes with just one call. Redemption and inspiration. The morning sun broke over the city with a warmth Marcus had once thought belonged only to dreams. He stood at the window of his small apartment, the curtains drawn back to let in the light. The walls were plain, the furniture minimal, but this space, his space, was proof that he had reclaimed a part of life that had once been stolen from him. Gone were the endless nights on cold concrete, the lingering uncertainty of where he would sleep, the gnawing fear of invisibility. In their place was something quieter, stronger, purpose. Each day brought him closer to the man he had always wanted to be, the man he could finally become. It had not been easy. The journey from that park bench to this apartment had been paved with small victories and occasional setbacks. There were days when the past threatened to pull him back into shadows, PTSD triggered by a sudden noise, paperwork lost, or an old friend from the streets reappearing with a tale of despair. But Marcus had learned that redemption was a process, not a single moment. And he had learned to embrace it. One of his first acts of giving back was mentorship. Marcus had begun volunteering at the Veteran Support Network, guiding younger veterans who were on the streets or in shelters. They would listen to his story, the battles abroad, the battles at home, and the transformative power of reaching out for help. And in their eyes, he saw hope mirroring his own, a reminder that even small gestures could ripple outward, touching lives in ways one could not predict. He remembered vividly the day a young veteran named Tyrone walked through the network's doors. Tyrone was tall, strong, but his eyes held the exhaustion of someone carrying invisible wounds. Marcus had sat with him, coffee in hand, and listened. "You think it's too late for someone like me?" Tyrone asked, voice tight. Marcus smiled gently, memories of his own darkest days surfacing. "It's never too late," he said. "I was homeless, alone, and forgotten. One call changed my life. One small step can start a chain reaction you can't even imagine." It was the same message Marcus had clung to during his own turning point, and now he passed it on with conviction. Over time, Tyrone found housing, began therapy, and even enrolled in a job program. Watching him flourish felt like a quiet victory, one of many that defined Marcus's new life. Beyond mentorship, Marcus discovered another form of redemption through storytelling. He began writing his memoir in earnest, recounting not only the struggles and despair, but also the triumphs, the small acts of kindness, and the moments that had sparked his transformation. Each page was a testament to resilience, a roadmap for those still trapped in the shadows. The city, once a reminder of isolation, now held promise. Marcus visited the same cafe where he had sipped his first hot cup of coffee before the police arrived. Mrs. Delaney greeted him warmly. "Marcus," she said, her eyes bright. "It's so good to see you doing well." He returned the smile, the memory of that fateful morning etched vividly in his mind. "I've got a place now," he said, "and work that keeps me busy. But more importantly, I'm helping others find their way just like I did." She nodded knowingly. It's amazing what one person can do when given a chance. Marcus reflected on that statement often. It was true. One call, one connection, one small act of courage had set everything in motion. From there came support, community, and the slowly rebuilding threads of a life that once seemed impossible to reclaim. Even his family connections, strained for decades, began to heal. His sister visited regularly, sharing meals and laughter, reconnecting over memories both happy and painful. The estranged relationships reminded him that redemption wasn't only about self. Sometimes it was about rebuilding bridges, offering forgiveness, and allowing others to grow alongside you. Marcus also learned to celebrate the small joys, morning walks in the park, reading letters from veterans he had mentored, the quiet satisfaction of completing another chapter in his memoir. Life was no longer measured by survival alone, but by moments of purpose, kindness, and connection. Word. of his journey spread slowly but surely. Other veterans, local community members, and even city officials began recognizing him not as a man who had been forgotten, but as someone whose story inspired action. He was invited to speak at local events, telling his story with humility, honesty, and hope. Audiences listened, many moved to tears, some motivated to make changes in their own lives. Yet Marcus never forgot the streets he had walked, the nights of loneliness, the uncertainty of survival. He returned often to volunteer at shelters, to serve meals, and to provide mentorship where it mattered most. The scars of the past, though still present, had transformed into tools for empathy, guidance, and inspiration. One evening, as the sun set and painted the city in golden hues, Marcus walked past the park bench where it all began. He paused, looking at the worn wood and the small indentation where he had rested that fateful morning. A quiet smile touched his lips. What had seemed like an ordinary cup of coffee, an ordinary morning, had become the seed of transformation. Marcus lifted his head, letting the breeze brush against his face. He had lived through struggle, faced fear, and endured despair. And now, through courage, persistence, and the support of those who believed in him, he had become a symbol of hope. A man who had once been invisible on the streets now stood as a beacon of possibility. And in the quiet of the evening he whispered to himself, not as a soldier, not as a veteran, not as a survivor, but as a man who had reclaimed his life. One call, one step, one chance. That's all it takes. Marcus walked on, carrying not only his own redemption, but also the promise that others, too, could rise from the shadows. His life was proof that the human spirit, when nurtured, could endure, heal, and inspire. The struggle had ended. The turning point had passed. And now Marcus's story was no longer just his own. It belonged to everyone who dared to believe in the power of hope, perseverance, and the courage to take that first step.